Okay, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to our final speaker series event for the academic year. My name is Kenji Yoshino, and I'm the faculty director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. For this event, I'm thrilled to introduce our distinguished guest, Ben Matlin. Ben is a journalist, essayist, and author of 3 books titled Miracle Boy Grows Up, How the Disability Rights Revolution Saved My Sanity, In Sickness and in Health, Love, Disability, and a Quest to Understand the Perils and Pleasures of Interabled Romance. And most relevantly for our discussion today, Disability Pride, the book that I'm holding up right now, Dispatches from a Post-ADA World. Ben is a senior writer for Financial Advisor magazine and has published essays in Time, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and many, many other outlets. We're delighted that he has joined us today for this important discussion. Toward the end of today's program, as is our wont, I will open up for Q&A. Please submit any questions you have through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can. So first of all, Ben, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'd love to start with a couple of grounding questions just to set the scene for our audience today. Toward the end of your book, you note that, quote, the disability tent is much bigger, close quote, than you had realized when you embarked on this project. Who is in this tent of the disability community, and how did your work on this book expand on your prior understanding?
Yes, it's true. You know, actually, let me start by describing myself. I'm an old white guy with not enough graying hair. I'm wearing glasses, a headset microphone with a black and white pillow behind my head. I'm actually talking to you from bed today, which I had not planned on doing, but I've been going through some medical stuff, and this was much more comfortable for me. And it's actually kind of relevant to our discussion. I wrestled with it. My vanity, or some would say my internalized ableism, you know, I ought to be upright with a bookshelf behind me and a nice blazer and shirt and you know, but I realize if I truly embrace disability pride, I've got to be accepting of what I need to be comfortable, what accommodations I need, and I reason that I could do it better, more comfortably this way. And that kind of speaks to your question, because the disability community, when you really understand what it means, it's not just people in wheelchairs or people who are deaf and blind. You know, it's a whole range of neurodiversities and autoimmune disorders, people with lupus or fibromyalgia, or I mean, on and on. And not just diagnosis, really. I mean, legally, it means anyone who is impaired in a sort of a major life-affecting way. That's not the legal language, but that's the idea. And their family members, and anyone perceived as such. So that was pretty broad in itself. But I think understanding the idea that, you know, there is no standard, there's no right way to be. We are a diverse population, and we function in different ways and have different needs in order to be able to function and be comfortable. So that's sort of what I mean by the broad tent. You know, it's yes, there are temporary disabilities, you break a leg skiing or something. And there are permanent ones, there are disabilities from birth, from disease, from accidents. There's all kinds of stories, all kinds of biographies in the disability community, and all kinds of needs and requirements. Uh, and there are those who are activists from bed, so people need to do that. You don't have to go marching in public to be an activist. So I learned a lot about that, about the range of folks who may not label themselves as disabled, but maybe they ought to. If they felt disability pride, they wouldn't be afraid to call themselves disabled, because it can really be very liberating. You can stop pretending that you're something you're not. I hope
so
that
appreciate
answers.
that. Absolutely. And I'll follow your good example and say that I am a person with dark hair and brown eyes, and I am wearing the blazer that you mentioned, and a blue shirt and a blue tie. Delighted to be with you. And thank you for that, personal note that you sounded both in the book, but early on in our conversation. This next kind of table setting question follows directly from that one, Ben, where you note, citing other scholars, that disability is often understood as a quote unquote tragedy in which people who suffer from their disability need to, as you put it, show courage and heroically overcoming their lot. You contrast this understanding with the title of the book, Disability Pride, where you describe as, quote, showing it all, not trying to cover it up, without shame or excuse or trepidation. So we didn't plan this in advance, but you got there immediately from the jump, and saying, you can actually be an activist right from your bed. Could you talk a bit more about these contrasting visions of disability and why disability pride is so important?
Sure. It means a lot of different things to different people. On the one hand, it's, I think, feeling okay about yourself as you are, not trying to pretend that you're, able to do stuff you're not able to do. Personal note, I mean, I was born with my disability. I never walked, I never stood, I always used a wheelchair. And yet I thought I could pass as a able-bodied person, even though I obviously could not. So it was part of my growing up, my coming of age, I guess, to be able to be honest, to ask for help, or ask for or demand accommodations when needed. But that's only a piece of it, I think, the sort of personal identity stuff, body image and all that it was part of it. But I found writing the book, as I learned more about the disability community at large and the history of disabled people, you almost can't help feeling proud to be part of that community and that history. A lot of disabled people do and have done, are doing all kinds of things, despite, oppressions and lack of access and so forth. We hate to say, we hate to be called inspiring, but I think we inspire each other. I can't help it. I read about folks, stuff they do and have done, and it's it's great to claim membership in that community, in that tradition of people who have to live their lives, as they define them, and not according to maybe the standards of the majority culture. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. So in your book, the subtitle of it refers to a post-ADA world. And, we have an audience both of lawyers and of non-lawyers, but you're referring there to the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the landmark civil rights legislation. I was wondering if you could tell this, for a general audience, to tell us what the ADA was and what it accomplished and what it didn't accomplish.
Yeah, the ADA is a major civil rights law. Well, basically it made it illegal to discriminate against people like me, or people perceived to be like me. And it's a very broad law, very inclusive, but it's had to be embellished through case law and legislation over the years. I mean, when it passed, there was no internet, so we've had to work on internet access. I go through in the book some of the case law. There's someone who wears glasses. Does that count as a disability? And it includes employment discrimination, public accommodations, a range of things that where you can't discriminate. But as broad as it is, it has limitations. And we can talk about this more, but there are building codes now to be ADA compliant. You put in a ramp or a light switch at a certain height, that kind of stuff. Braille signs so people can see where they know where they're going. But sometimes people get bogged down in the letter of the law and miss the spirit of it. And so there is a wave of younger folks with disabilities who are trying to expand beyond these sort of civil rights definitions of fairness. But let me back up a bit. I mean, not that long ago in my lifetime, disabled kids were not really well educated. A lot never went to school, or they were segregated in special ed, substandard education, really. I'm going to forget the date. 78, I believe, was the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, now called Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that made public schools accessible, or endeavors to make them accessible. But I talked to some people younger than me who grew up, with that access in school. But what happened after they graduated? There was no planning for a life ahead as an adult. The ADA made that possible. It enabled people to imagine a future of equal access and opportunity. So I think in a sense, in an important sense, the biggest change the ADA wrought was kind of conceptual. All of a sudden, disabled people weren't just a bunch of patients, sick people under doctor's care. It was population, a population with a history of discrimination. And part of the multicultural mix of our society and deserving of all society has to offer. So it was an attitude shift as well as a legal shift.
Yeah, you again anticipate where I'm going, because one of the things we talk a lot about in thinking about how social change happens is how much the law is kind of a mirror and how much of it is a motor of the cultural attitudes that also need to change. One of the things I really appreciate about your book was how subtle it was, and its kind of lucid understanding of how law and culture interact with each other. So you write that the ADA not only, quote, created opportunities via access, close quote, but also, quote, sparked a cultural shift in how we as a society regard the disability community, close quote. Could you please describe that cultural shift, now that we've done the legal one, but the cultural shift that the ADA, that occurred in the wake of the ADA, let me put it that way.
Well, what happens when you start removing barriers? You see more people with visible disabilities in the shopping malls and movie theaters, in workplaces. All of a sudden, people who may have been hidden away are out and about. They're public. They're shopping and spending money and earning money and speaking out. And it has been a cultural shift, I feel. I mean, I'm old enough to remember a time, when you did not see people in wheelchairs out in the bathroom, except for grandparents. But people like me, I thought I was the only one, and that's huge. In schools too. And my kids grew up with classmates with disabilities. Some had shadow teachers and assistants to help them manage, but that was not an option for me in school. It's a great thing, I read recently the SAT is going all electronic, won't be on paper. When I took it, my mother had to talk to the proctor to say, his pencil marks are not very dark. Will you make sure, go over his little, fill in a little circle, make sure it's dark enough for the machine to read. I mean, there were no accommodations for someone like me taking a standardized test. Pretty much everybody has had to, I hope, think a little bit differently about how the system works. And most people, know about ADA accommodations and restaurants, hotels, theaters, etc. It has become part of the mainstream conversation, which it was not before.
Absolutely. So another thing that I really appreciate about your book, Ben, is how insistently intersectional it was. So you always talk about how individuals belong to multiple identities in addition to the identity of having a disability. And more broadly, you note that, quote, without the civil rights movement, it's doubtful that there would have been a disability rights movement, close quote. Can you tell us a little bit more about the connections between the disability rights movement and other struggles for social justice and equality?
Sure. I think it's fair to say some of the early activists for the ADA were inspired by the African American civil rights movement. And in fact, some of the early protesters were joined by the Black Panther movement, got a lot of assistance working together. But as the cause has developed a sort of new wave, which they're calling disability justice. One of the elements of that is connection, allyship with all other social justice movements. I mean, there is overlap. We're interconnected. Again, the idea of rejecting a standard, a person must be X, Y, and Z. We, kind of throw that out and talk about how people really are. And within the disability community, there are people of color and white folks like me. There are people who are queer. There are people, I mean, there's all kinds, of course. And I think people don't want their identities in conflict. We have to kind of embrace all these causes if we're going to really move forward. Like you can't say, we accept this kind, but not that kind. I confess I made that mistake early on. We were several years ago protesting the Jerry Lewis MDA telethon. Jerry Lewis was getting an honorary Oscar for his charitable work, and a bunch of us were a bit offended because we thought his charitable work was bad for disabled folks, was counterproductive. And somebody brought up, yeah, he makes fun of gay people too. And I thought, one thing at a time, let's not confuse the issue. I think I was wrong. I've learned my lesson. We have to take a broad social justice perspective if we're going to move, move the needle, move things along, and try to create a truly inclusive society.
Thank you for that. Another great aspect of your book is how it actually, again, in this Big Tent idea, moves from looking at one cohort of individuals' disabilities to another. And one of the things that I found most educational was your work on neurodiversity and the autistic community. One of the points that you make is that even with regard to our signage, the paradigmatic case of the person with a disability is a person in a wheelchair, or the person who has a physical disability. And you argue that we should expand the lens in order to understand, other forms of less apparent disability. So if you could talk a little bit more about the specific challenges that people in the neurodiverse community face, that would be fantastic. And could you also tell us what we as organizations can do to be more inclusive on issues of neurodiversity?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. That was a difficult chapter for me because I said to my editor, I'm not autistic. I'm neurotypical, as they say. It's not really appropriate for me to speak about that community, to speak for that community. So, but I didn't want to exclude them either, It's an important part of the community and an important development since the ADA, the idea of autistic self-advocacy. I tried as much as possible to quote people from the community, so have their words tell the story, not my words. But what I came to understand is that just as people's bodies function in different ways, so do their brains, their minds function differently. And there's a range, But I think a lot of people would sort of qualify as neurodivergent who might not recognize themselves as such. There are all these theories about the so-called geeks, the techno wizards, who might in fact be autistic to a degree, the ability to concentrate and focus on things. But it's hard to talk, for me anyway, to talk about accessible environments for autistic people. There is some work in this. For some folks, transitioning is difficult. So gradual transitions and scheduling and pace, even in the physical environment. Also, some folks need a quiet space, a quiet room to kind of collect their thoughts. Somewhat related, I think, are things like trigger warnings. There are people who've been traumatized. That's a little different, but when people are able to have a smoother transition and to be sort of better prepared for situations, it can be helpful. But it's hard, at least for me, to come up with a kind of a checklist. Do this, do that. It's just important to realize and to respect that people do things, need to do things in different ways, even if it's not physically obvious to you that they need those things. There are some horrible examples of people who have been killed by law enforcement because their behavior was misunderstood. It's apparently very common, not always well reported, but that sort of it can get very bad, very dangerous for people, and we need to be aware of that, I think, too.
Yeah, I mean, shifting gears from law to medicine there, you devote a chapter of your book to the topic of healthcare disparities, Ben, and you argue that there are systemic structural issues in healthcare and also problems with attitudes of the habits of individual medical practitioners. So this is both a systemic issue and a individual attitudes issue. How would you describe the healthcare challenges that people with disabilities face and what needs to change?
I think that surprises people. You think a doctor's office or a hospital would be pretty accessible. Really not true. It should be, by law. I mean, they're covered by the ADA, but I've never seen a doctor's office with an examination table with grab bars, as you would find in a public bathroom stall, or adjustable height or whatever. I've never seen a sign language interpreter at a doctor's office. Masks that people should wear are rarely transparent for those who read lips or get signals from facial expressions. Beyond that, or in addition to that, there are studies. I'm going to mess up her name. There's a doctor at Harvard, Iannoli, I think, who has MS, multiple sclerosis, and she surveyed her fellow doctors most admitted they had no training or experience with disabled patients. And many of them admitted that they would rather not have any disabled patients. That, you call the office and say, gee, I need a sign language interpreter, or are you wheelchair accessible? And they might say, oh, we have no openings. We can't see you. I have not experienced that per se, but I have personally experienced, how shall I put it, bad attitudes. Partly it's got to do, I think, with medical arrogance. I've always felt that people like me represent, as doctors, we represent a failure of their profession. I'm not curable. Boy, let me reach an example. I was in the hospital in December for about 8 days. And on the second day, I was lying in the hospital bed. My wife, who had been by my bedside almost around the clock, stepped out for a bit to get a cup of coffee in the morning. And two nurses, I guess they were, came in to check my skin for pressure sores. And rather than tell me what they were going to do or ask me if it was okay, they started moving my body around to check for pressure behind my ankles, behind my ears. First, they lifted my head in a way that kind of pressed on my breathing tube, but it pressed my chin down, and I couldn't really breathe, and I couldn't open my mouth to talk because they pushed my head forward. Then they rolled me over, and it got worse. I was really squeezed by my neck and my jaw, and all I could do was sort of groan, like, ugh, ugh, ugh. And, the reaction was, don't worry, it'll be over soon. We're almost done. But I passed out. I could not breathe. Next thing I know, I'm waking up and everything is rapid. It's like a movie on fast forward. And I'm surrounded by doctors and nurses. They bring out an ambu bag, which basically puffs air into your lungs. My wife, meanwhile, was down in the cafeteria and she heard over the loudspeaker code blue in room whatever it was, and she knew what was going on. She raced back upstairs, but she was stopped by security because it was early in the morning and she still had yesterday's ID badge. They'd update her name badge, and she gets upstairs. There's a crowd at my room. They didn't want to let her in. They finally did. And she knew what to do. You had to kind of lift my neck up to open my airways. I have a little trach button you can probably see. I had to open that up and do a little suctioning. And I was fine. Now, afterward, as I'm recovering, I kind of laughed about it. I thought, God, those two wound people checking my skin, I bet they learned a lesson. I hope they did. Now, could they know in advance not to do that to me? I wish, but I am unique. We all are, and my body maybe isn't typical for like anybody else. But at least a little more, I don't know, respect for my bodily integrity. When you see people like me as having a poor quality of life, as surveys show, medical professionals tend to believe, despite, I mean, not knowing anything else about our lives, just based on the diagnosis or whatever, or when you don't have experience with disabled bodies or minds, you can become dismissive. Now, I understand that see a lot of people, they're overworked, blah, 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 but it can be very dangerous. And there are many cases of disabled people who have died because of lack of adequate treatment, often because of a presumption that disabled people aren't, in some cases, aren't worth the full measure of medical intervention. I always have to insist in hospitals that I'm full code. I am not, do not resuscitate. My life is worth living. There are also cases of insurance refusing treatment that people need, and people suffer and even die as a result. So it's a huge topic. But overall, to me, it's an attitudinal thing. And disabled people should not be considered less than, should not be considered sort of expendable or less deserving of full care and respect.
Absolutely.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Absolutely. And in a similar vein, I want to ask about a sensitive subject that you address in the book, which is a push for the legalization of assisted suicide. So one of the things that we teach in constitutional law is a case called Washington versus Glucksberg in 1997, where the Supreme Court said that there is no constitutional right to physician-assisted suicide. And the author of that opinion was Chief Justice William Rehnquist, with whom I often find myself disagreeing. But one of the things that your book has done is to open my eyes to parts of his opinion where he shows great sensitivity towards individuals with disabilities and the negative unintended consequences that a right to physician-assisted suicide might have on a very vulnerable population, for all the reasons that you describe of just prejudices against individuals with disabilities, leading to the view that their lives are less valuable or less worthy of dignity in the way that you just rebutted in very eloquent terms. So could you please speak a little bit about how you and perhaps others in the disability community think about the issue of physician-assisted suicide?
Sure, it's a very complicated topic, and I've thought about it. I've written about it quite a lot. Boy, I do hate to be in the position of, speaking for the community. I cannot. There are a lot of disabled folks who like the idea of physician-assisted suicide. If life becomes too hard, I want an out. I want a way out. I'm all about self-determination and pro-choice, and I want that choice. I don't blame them. I understand that. But I think it's a little simplistic. My problem is when you talk about legalization of assisted suicide, it's often based on these kinds of prejudices that I've already talked about. And it must be, it should be counterbalanced with equal effort to guarantee the right to live with a disability. If I don't have opportunities, if I don't have access to whatever, the town square, to love and marriage, to parenthood, to anything, school, movies, no wonder I'd want to kill myself. We need to realize the deck is stacked. It's not really a free choice if you're not given the alternative. Put it another way, I've also argued, okay, allow suicide for disabled people or people with terminal diagnoses if you allow it for everybody. Let's all be free to commit suicide. I guess I can't have a problem with that, maybe. But problem is society doesn't go for that. But oh no. Those people are depressed, they need intervention. We have suicide hotlines. Why is it different for somebody with a diagnosis? Aren't we, it's technically my disability, some would consider terminal, although I've, outlived expectations, many of us do, but aren't we entitled to due process under the law and equal protections under the law? And again, I talk a lot about attitudes, but I feel like if society says, okay, those people are less worthy of having their lives protected against whatever self-harm or whatever, it's such a discouraging message for those of us who are trying to live. Maybe society doesn't want us or feels we're somehow less worthy. There are also economic implications. It may be cheaper for providers of managed care to offer poison than to pay for wheelchairs, ventilators, whatever else people need to live. So this effort to legalize, I think, is based on an unconscious prejudice and has really dangerous repercussions.
Yeah,
At least that's my point of view.
No, I appreciate that. And of course, I don't expect you to speak for an entire community, but I will say that your eloquence on this has changed many minds. I assigned your book, as I mentioned, I have assigned it for the past 2 years and it's changed many minds among my students. So thank you for that. So I'm going to move now to audience questions. The first two are kind of paired with each other and they both deal with the issue of inspiration that we were talking about earlier. So the first is, and I'll ask them together and you can answer them in whichever order you wish. In your opinion, how do you gently correct well-intentioned people that call you an inspiration, especially strangers? This gets annoying sometimes. And then the second question is, how do you personally define the difference between being inspiring as an activist to the disabled community and so-called, quote unquote, inspiration porn? And you actually write about this phenomenon in your book. I believe the term comes from the late comedian and journalist Stella Young, right, who defines inspiration porn as portraying disabled people as heroic for living ordinary lives. It's like pornography in that it objectifies one group of people for the benefit of another group. So you quote her there. So in whichever order, like how do you gently correct somebody who talks about you as an inspiration? And then alternatively, how do you distinguish between being inspiring as an activist and being subjected to inspiration porn?
It's a good question. I mean, part of me always felt flattered to be called inspirational, but yeah, it can be dangerous. Put you up on a pedestal you're not a regular person anymore. What do I say to people? I say, oh, come on, I'm just living my life, doing my thing. What choice have I had? Stuff like that, I say. There are people who will stop me on the street and say, oh, it's good you're out today. Like, what? I don't even know what that means. It's good you're out today, too. I try to come up with clever responses, but I usually fail. Yes, if I'm going to be inspirational, I guess, I would prefer it to be for something I've done other than, surviving, living a normal life. But at some point, I began thinking, whatever you want to think of me as inspired, then be inspired. I don't care. I'm going to go on and do my own thing and not let it upset me too much. Worse, perhaps, this comes up more in my second book about relationships, is if people tell my wife, who is non-disabled, that she's inspirational for being with me. That feels more offensive. I mean, my wife is worthy of all kinds of praise, but sometimes it gets a little silly, and she'll always try to divert people, switch it around. Well, I'm lucky to be with him. Not just he's lucky to be with me. We get a lot of that too. I find that more irksome. But yes, there are still many, many examples of inspiration porn out there where a disabled person is portrayed in media, I guess, solely for that purpose, to make other people feel good. And that may help that person, but doesn't really help the community very much. uh, there are, how do I say this? There are a lot of disabled folks on social media with YouTube channels, and it raises awareness, or they raise awareness of various issues, and I guess that's good. But too often I feel like they're just saying, hey, I count. I'm important. Don't underrate me and my life and my worth. And they can lack a community consciousness. That to me is part of the problem of the inspirational business, inspiration point. It tends to be about one person and not recognizing the systemic issues that are part of what all of us deal with.
That leads into another pair of questions about what forms of self-advocacy are most effective, right? If being an inspiration is not, right? At least in the ways that you've just described. So the first question in this pair says, I'm a blind professor at NYU Wagner, and we just wrapped up our spring class in disability policy and leadership. We discussed the importance of representation in class. Could I ask Ben what he feels is most important for us as a disabled community to do to increase representation at senior levels in organizations, public life, academia, etc.? And then another question about self-advocacy is, beyond self-identification, is there anything that we as disabled people can be doing on an individual scale to advocate for ourselves in the workplace?
Yeah, those are good questions too. Oh boy, I don't know. Yeah, I think there is a tendency for some of us, I've certainly been there, to be overachievers. Uh, have to be the best at something to really impress people. Uh, I think that's a mistake. I don't think you have to. A mistake isn't the word I want. Uh, we need to be. We should be valued by virtue of being human beings, not by what we accomplish in a material sense or economic sense. Uh, Sometimes I try to point out to people who would not think of discriminating on the basis of race or skin color, but don't realize it's the same if you discriminate against somebody because of a disability. I try to draw comparisons, which kind of embarrasses people, I think. Uh, I like to believe that people can be educated and that people mean well. Uh, how to do it, everybody does it in a different way. I knew early on I wanted to write, and that was the way for me to do it. I wasn't going to go on rallies and with a megaphone and shout at people. Just not my way. People that do that do great things, and they have a purpose too. I just think there are many ways to advocate. Some people focus on the media. What people see on TV will affect their attitudes. Other people focus on the law, uh, access laws and so forth. I guess it's kind of hard to say what works best or what people should do. I think you do what you feel comfortable doing. And I think it helps a lot to join with the community. You get ideas and you work together, and it's probably the best way to make any kind of progress is with a group effort, not just an individual. I'm not sure that answers the questions, but
No, I think it definitely does, Ben, but it leads very beautifully into this next one, which is the challenges of organizing in that way when based on the sheer diversity of the disability community, which we were talking about before. So thanks for this question, which is as follows. A lot of the advocacy support and resources for people with disability seems to be divided among conditions or diagnosis. So for example, people who are deaf or hard of hearing, people with epilepsy, et cetera, et cetera. Even though we have different lived experiences and need different accommodations, we all share an identity of disability. How can the disability community work in a more unified manner to make progress?
yeah, I mean that's an important point. We talked earlier about the big tent. I agree. I think it's important to have that broader perspective. A lot of people don't. Uh, I, I, I'm not sure how to change that. Uh, it, there are people within the disability community, who will put down other people in the disability community uh, for whatever reason. Uh, But thanks to technology and the internet, you know, a lot of different sectors of the community are being heard from or are, you know, communicating. And you know, that the internet can be a way to join community. I interviewed a number of people for the book who said, you know, I thought I was the only one like me in the world. And I went online and discovered, you know, I'm not weird or unusual. There are a lot of us. And that helped these people gain a sense of disability pride. And from there to a kind of an activism. But there are many forms of activism. And sometimes activism can be very quiet, you know, very subtle. As we said before, you can be an activist from bed if that's what you need to do. So, you know, I tried in the book to kind of address this stuff because I've had comments from readers. I don't know, someone in a wheelchair who did not understand other, you know, whatever, deaf people, autistic people. We do tend to get siloed, and that I think is a, you know, to the detriment of our community. No, I recommend joining together as much as possible.
I'm going to squeeze in one last question because I think it's such an important one that underscores how the burden can't just be on the shoulders of community members. So this questioner says, as a white person, I understand the role I ought to have with respect to racial justice issues is a necessary one. What role should non-disabled allies play with respect to issues of disability justice?
That's a fair question too. Boy, it is very important, I think, to make sure that the people affected by whatever issue be the ones to speak out about it or address the problem from their personal perspective. It is way too common for organizations, even you know, groups of people that claim to want to support disabled folks to think they know what's best for them. There are a lot of cases of parents advocating for their disabled kids, and it's not always appropriate. I mean, it's helpful, you know, to have the support, but the disabled people themselves, I think, must be the ones getting the attention and the you know, the ones that people listen to, or I should say listen to. It sounds ableist as well, but that we get to express ourselves and not try to have others talk for us. It takes a humility, I think, for a non-disabled ally to sort of step back. But I think that's what it takes. I mean, we need all of our allies. We do, they're important. But yeah, they've got to respect that you know, we're not children. And I believe we know what's best for us. We know what we need.
That, I think, brings us to a close. Ben Matlin, it has been an absolute pleasure and honor to speak with you. The book is Disability Pride, Dispatches from a Post-ADA World. Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you all in the audience for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. Thank everyone for joining in.